Hello, everyone. Today we have with us Professor Eltis. She's a professor of English and Theatre Studies at Oxford University, and she's a tutorial fellow at Brasenose College. Her research focuses a lot on Victorian and modern literature, especially drama and issues of performance studies and theatre history. Also, sexuality and gender, women's suffrage, and politics within these texts and these times. So from what I can tell from your research, you're very interested in a range of topics, but with 19th and 20th century drama and women's roles in them being two really big ones. So I know a lot of graduate students, myself included, find it difficult sometimes to pinpoint their research on something or someone, what exactly they should be studying. And I was wondering what you think of that process of choosing what or who to study. And I'm wondering, how do you approach that process of pinning down exactly what or who resonates with you, and what led you to your own research topics?
Well, I'd say the biggest prompt, like the most important question to ask about your area of research is always, will I enjoy it? So you're going to spend so much time reading around the area, staying with it, rereading certain texts again and again and again. So I think pleasure is actually about the most important thing where it comes to that. And therefore wanting to know more. I'd say nowadays, a lot of the time what leads my research is what I'm asked to do. So, you get asked if you'll contribute to this or write on this or edit that. And then it's, what do I want to spend time reading? And often I'm saying yes to things actually because I'd like to know about it, not because I already know about it. Like I know enough to know that I want to know more. So curiosity, I think pleasure and curiosity really importantly. For my doctorate, so it was on Oscar Wilde, and I started on Wilde simply because and this was like back in the 1980s, when, probably most of the people out there were like embryos, if that. Or their parents were embryos, I don't know. Sorry. Back then, Wilde was actually quite largely neglected in a lot of ways. He wasn't regarded as an important writer in any way. There was Richard Ellman's biography of Wilde, but that was sort of began to sort of awake more interest in Wilde. So I wanted to work on Wilde because I loved Wilde, and he did seem to be a writer that not enough had been done on. And then the other thing I think about research is you in the game, as a graduate student, as an undergraduate writing your dissertations on, you have to spend lots of time writing abstracts or proposals or outlines at a point when you don't know what will fit into that, or your proposal is what you're hoping to find and you don't know if you will. So a lot of the time I think, writing a proposal is about writing something that looks feasible. So you've got a sense of what a book or a study or a dissertation might be. And then you need to start with something that's a core of something you're interested in, which I sometimes think of as like a handful, like, when you make a snowman, you start with a snowball and then you roll it in snow and it gets bigger and bigger. And that's almost how it happens, I think, as you start with a core and then you read and it organically takes its own form. So with my book on Wilde, I started with an interest in Wilde and Wilde's plays. I ended up reading a whole load of reviews of their reception, which then showed how far reviewers were endlessly linking them to French plays that had preceded, the idea that Wilde had stolen a lot from other playwrights. I read those plays and then saw the ways in which Wilde had adapted and changed and made much more politically radical and socially radical and sexually radical what was essentially very conservative material that he'd frankly nicked from other playwrights. And that was my master's dissertation. And I was going to then go on with my doctorate to do all of Wilde using a similar approach. But by pure serendipity, about a term into my doctoral studies, I came across simply actually because of visiting a friend and checking out the archives where she was in America. And finding that there are early drafts of Wilde's plays that radically differed from later drafts, which nobody I'd come across had written on or done anything on. And then I followed that and actually found it meshed entirely with what I'd looked at on his reception. So how far early drafts were much, much closer to the conservative source material. And then he rewrote in successive drafts to take it something more radical. So that's a kind of example of the serendipity of the stuff as you start, you don't know is out there. and then you discover and it grows. So
Yeah.
does that make sense on a way of like choosing, you know?
Definitely. No, definitely. I think that metaphor of like the snowball growing bigger and bigger is so accurate, because I can say from my own experience with like dissertations and things, they're often never what you expect they're going to be in the end. And that's why I have a lot of friends who write the introductions last and things. And
Oh
I
yeah.
usually try to not do that, but I end up having to revise what I've written. So that is kind of the way to do it sometimes. So it is kind of like this exploration or this kind of detective work, like how you're saying, like you found these texts and you were thinking, how did this happen? Like you kind of uncovering this. It's really, I think, accurate to academic study for sure.
Absolutely. And I think when it comes to introductions, I think, yeah, you write it last. So you do a lot of the reading for it, because some of the introduction is the background that you need. But actually writing it, you're introducing your thesis or your dissertation. So it's rather like saying, I've written the introduction for the visiting speaker. I don't know who the speaker will be, but obviously, you know, so, you know, you are introducing something quite specific. So yes, you have to have written it before you can finally write the introduction.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah. And it's a very kind of long process, because you want to just go step by step, but that's not how it works. You have to kind of wind your way through.
Mm.
Um,
And you
definitely.
disappear down lots of doors off the corridor into other rooms and other houses, and you come back again, and then
Definitely.
you think what you
Yeah.
thought was on, it turns out to be something different. And then
Yeah.
you inevitably go through, you read, you come across other studies, or new studies get published, and you go, oh no, someone's written my book. And then you realize that actually they've saved you a lot, you know, and you go into despair, and
Yeah.
then you realize you disagree with what they think, gives you something else to argue against, or they've done lots of the dog work for you, so now there's lots you don't need to say.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a similar experience with my master's dissertation, which I submitted, so that's great. And yeah, I ended up writing on something very different to what I thought I was going to initially write about. It was on Kathy Acker, actually, who's
Hmm.
this very wild experimental novelist in the 1980s. And she lived in New York, and I'm from New York, so that kind of, I resonated towards her for that. But a similar thing happened where I kept, articles kept coming up, and I kept being like, I could have written about any one of these topics from all of these different articles, that JSTOR and other texts and other scholarly works. And I could have chosen one of the 20 or 30, and I could have had 30 different examples of my dissertation. It just ended up being that one,
Yeah,
you know?
that's perfect. And that's where you discover that the original ideas you had were actually quite rich, that your
Yeah.
instinct had taken you to something where there was a lot to say. But
Yeah.
always an element of luck in it.
Definitely. I completely agree. So just moving kind of into your particular research, can you kind of set the stage for us, which I think is an apt metaphor for what we're going to discuss, for what we're going to discuss, and tell us about some of the key themes that are at play on the Victorian stage? For example, what do we need to know about what was happening in the Victorian period to aptly understand Victorian drama, Victorian literature, and things like this? And how can we understand the major characteristics of Victorian drama through this kind of lens?
Well, I'd probably start with Victorian theatre within the 19th century. So
Definitely.
one of the cliches about the 19th century is the idea that there was anti-theatrical prejudice, that there was an idea that the stage was immoral, was corrupting, was debased, that people were mostly opposed to it, and so on. Actually, it's rather like if you on screen culture in the 20th century. So television, cinema, computer games, mobile phones, all the way through. You can read a whole load of articles on how these are the end of civilization, how they are destroying culture, how people will no longer have conversation, how far they're a source of moral degeneracy or whatever else. And if you looked at those kind of articles, you would construct this idea of the 20th century as utterly opposed to any kind of literature or culture or drama or communication on screen. And that would be complete and utter nonsense, because you cannot do the 20th century without those. And it's the same with Victorian theatre. So absolutely, there were critics of Victorian theatre, but it was the most popular genre, the most popular form of entertainment in the 19th century. And between 30 and 40,000 new plays were written and staged in the course of the 19th century.
Wow.
Yeah, huge. And just in London, I mean, in the last sort of 3-4 decades of the 19th century, you get this explosion in the number of theatres. So at the beginning of the century, there are 2 licensed theatres, the so-called monopoly theatres, Covent Garden and Drury Lane, who can stage whatever kind of theatre they like. By 1843, that monopoly is broken, and from then on, you get more and more and more theatres built. And there were lots of minor theatres doing melodrama and doing burlesque and doing all sorts of less respectable forms of drama before that. But by the end of the century, you've got over 100 sort of sites of entertainment, theatres, music halls, and all the rest of it in London. And they seat up to 3,000 to 4,000, the largest of them. They're enormous, and the kind of money. It's also, I mean, really important things to go out about Victorian theatre. Women, it was one of the only professions in which women could gain equal status with men. So there were actresses paid equal to actors. Obviously, there's the same kind of gender gap standard in payment in that, but there are women who manage their own theatres, lease their own theatres. In the case of, say, Lily Langtry or Sarah Bernhardt, they became successful actresses and then bought their own theatres. Even early on, say, Madame Vestris in the 1830s, she's running a company with 200 employees that include like 90 carpenters. Because that's the other thing, is think of it. So Victorian spectacular theatre, the ones that are in these theatres that have, you know, kind of 2,000-3,000 people in, it's really the equivalent to Hollywood film, in that sense of its huge physical spectacle. The scripts are a very small part of it. So it's one of the problems with, one of the challenges, not the problems, but the challenges of studying 19th century theatre is, imagine studying cinema of the last 4 decades with nothing but scripts. So, you know, if you're studying Titanic or Star Wars or Avatar or, you know, Pirates of the Caribbean or something, and all you have is the script.
Yeah.
And you have to try and reimagine what it is that everybody, like, what's the big fuss about? Because this dialogue is not necessarily doing it for me. So it's that challenge of trying to rethink, revisualize, reimagine the actual impact, the way it was received, what the spectacle was, and what it meant to people at that point. I think another thing is it's theatre of the people, certainly beginning of the century. So one of my favorite things, 1809, there were the old price riots, which is when Covent Garden was refurbished and the manager reopened it with more private boxes and very sort of socially tiered and separated out entrances, and very few of the cheap seats in the pit. And the audience rioted over this. And they carried on rioting for 67 nights until the manager gave in and took out the private boxes and returned the old prices.
Wow.
That's
so it just shows you how important this was to the people, literally. Yeah.
So in that sense, and it's a lot of the really successful plays in the 19th century, all the classes are in there at the, you know, they're huge theatres, and it's not just for the upper classes or the middle classes, the working class, they're actually all in there together. And a lot of the reviews talk about how the play is managing to play to pit gallery, boxes, stalls all at once in different ways.
Yeah, definitely. It almost kind of reminds me of what was happening in the long 18th century with novels, where they were kind of taboo and looked down upon, but they were so wildly popular in this coffee house culture. I guess every age kind of has their new art form that is kind of trashy or viewed as trashy. Like now it's no longer TV. Now I would maybe say it's social media and reality TV, these kinds of things.
Yep.
The trashy, guilty pleasures.
Yeah, and actually, and same way I always say that with, I mean, when my kids were young, it was video games were seen as the really dangerous thing. Now it's, I mean, obviously social media, other issues and so on around, but a lot of the language of how this is dangerous for youth, it's exactly the same language as about the novel in the 18th century. So that you'll lose the art of conversation, that you won't be able to tell reality from fiction, that you'll start imitating what you read, that it will get you too emotionally engaged and you'll stop thinking properly. You know, it's I mean, it's
sense and sensibility. Yes.
Exactly. And a lot of it is, and it's most dangerous for children and the less educated, the working classes, and in the 18th century, in the 19th century, obviously for women. All these,
For women, yes.
Anybody who is not a man who is entirely in control of their own intelligence and all the rest of it.
No, definitely. It really actually reminds me of like people warning women to stay off Instagram because if they look at a post, they're going to automatically get like surgery on their face and they're going to just disfigure themselves. And it's like, if someone's going to do that, they can do that. Like, but it doesn't necessarily mean if you look at it, it's just going to appear on you.
Yeah. And then the exception to that are the commentators or the people investigating it who can somehow look at those in an entirely analytical way without going into it. So, with all of these things, there's always a grain of truth in there somewhere, but I think it's worth looking at the ways in which the same kind of rhetoric and the same fears are applied to every new medium as it arrives. And then we work out what to do with it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you're touching on an important thread of kind of who's interpreting it is very key here. For example, if it's a man, if it's a woman, if it's a young child, if it's someone who's already analyzing it, like an investigative journalist or something, writing an article on social media or novels or whatever it may be. And I think we're going to touch on that a bit later when it comes to female portrayals of characters in theater and who exactly is watching that portrayal, who is interpreting it, which is, I think, a very kind of nuanced and interesting idea. But yeah, so we kind of have a bunch of these ideas at play in Victorian theater. I think spectacle is a really interesting one. And the fact that you're right, we can't ever know what exactly it looks like, which is something I have a really hard time conceptualizing when I read plays and when I read theater, because I have a tendency to just analyze the words and the language and just close read very, very rigidly. But I remember one of my seminars this past year was with Dr. Sarah Meir, and she taught 19th century spectacle and theater. And we read this play called Engaged. And it was just a madhouse show of spectacle, and people were running and coming and costume changes and people were hitting each other and there's the train crash and all these different things. And I think it's very hard for us in the modern age to actually imagine, you're right, how big these spectacles were.
Yeah, Sarah's a brilliant scholar. I love her work. And if you think about, so both of us work on Boucicault a certain amount, and he was kind of the master grand sensational effects kind of producer and conceiver of the 19th century. So his play, The Poor of New York, was the inventor in some ways of what got known as a sensation scene. So the play climaxes with a fire in this big tenement building, where Boucicault himself designed how it was done so that the front wall was in two pieces, and then it was done so as the fire happened, the walls came down and the roof came in, and there were like the shutters on the windows were attached with something that would then explode and the shutters fall off. And this was all done on stage in a snowstorm with then a fire engine drawn by a real horse kind of came on stage to put it out. And that's in 1857.
It almost seems like theater has gone a bit downhill or something from there, because that would never happen today. The PETA companies would be protesting about animal safety and fire hazards and things like that. That would never.
Well, there wasn't real fire, so he did a lot of it with. So some of it would be like sort of smoke effects and light effects and things like that. But I think certainly on, you're right, animal rights will be involved. So another colleague or two other colleagues are working on death on the 19th century stage and so on. Hayley Bradley, who's this wonderful scholar at Manchester, is working on death, which included like the plays that had live horses, like for Ben-Hur and things like that, and for various, horse races on stage became fashion. And there was one point where somebody in the orchestra pit, with the, his orchestra was playing through a lot of these, was crushed by a horse where the, I think it was conveyor belt that the horse was galloping on jammed. So the horse like went off the stage into the pit and crushed somebody.
Wow.
Not one of the standard hazards of theatre going nowadays.
Very true. You wouldn't read that in the Times today. Nothing like that. No, that's very shocking. So so if we continue along these lines of spectacle and aestheticism and sensation, these kinds of big, almost very like tactile words, these kinds of big ideas, I think we are led to this notion that we keep hearing, I think, when it comes to 19th century theater, this notion of decadence. And I think it's a very elusive term. I have heard like 10 definitions in my life of decadence. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your opinion on this elusive, slippery word, decadence, and why it's so significant to Victorian and 19th century theater and literature.
Whoa. Well, I start saying I don't think that it is very important with theatre. I think in some ways, so if I've done, when I was writing on theatre and decadence, one of those sort of I've done a couple of handbook essays randomly where I've been asked to do things on theatre and decadence. And one of the things you can do with the wonderful newspaper search terms you can now do, in those kind of archives, put in theatre and decadence or drama and decadence, and articles worrying about the decadence of the drama you can find through the whole of the 19th century. But in that sense, exactly what we've been talking about, the kind of the decadence of youth, or the worries about the decline of conversation or the decline of the family or whatever, read Anglo-Saxon literature and it's all doom and death and everything passes and, civilization is on the edge. So in that sense, the worries about decadence as in decay and decline, they're common not just through the 19th century, but in any age, and referring to pretty much any marker of civilization. People, there's always a bit of we're all going to hell in a handcart going on at any time. And if you know Frank Kermode's wonderful Sense of an Ending, which is a brilliant little book from back in, I don't know, was it the 80s or the 90s? But it was basically 1980s, 1990s, was arguing that the end of each century has a kind of, there's the way that literature, that shape that comes from the sense of where the ending's arriving, that shapes the sense of a century as well. So the 1890s look back to the 1790s, which is then looking back to the French Revolution and so on, which again is, for sort of Lady Bracknell's, response to finding out that Jack's been, supposedly born and bred in a handbag. Which seems to show a contempt for the ordinary decencies of family life, which reminds one of the worst excesses of the French Revolution. And we all know what that movement led to, kind of, which is. So that sense that, the end of the century is a time of threat, a time of decay, etc. The sort of, the end of the 19th century, where people were, a lot of parallels between where Western civilization was going and the end of the Roman Empire and so on. That's it. And I think decadence is particular in that it's an aesthetic, or it's a set of concerns that's not just about decline, but certainly at the end of the 19th century about the idea of over-sophistication. So it wasn't necessarily the threat of the kind of barbarians at the gate. That was earlier in the century, the worry about Philistines and so on, the kind of Matthew Arnold Culture and Anarchy and so on. I think the end of the century, there was a worry about, in some ways, aspects of civilization, so-called, having gone too far. So the idea of the dandy, of the over-sophisticated, of the idea of the over-intellectual, especially the over-intellectualized woman, which goes back to Maudsley and things like that, the idea that if we do too much thinking, we're denying blood to our wombs, and we'll end up kind of infertile and unhealthy, and et cetera, and there's all that kind of thing. The idea of, in a sense, what might be the markers of civilization having gone too far, but also I'd say that's one of the things that's interesting about, that I find fascinating in ideas of decadence, the investigation, the idea of form, not just decaying, but sort of fracturing, becoming, mutating, becoming that. I love the Bourget idea of it breaking into parts, so that the chapter is separate from the book, the paragraph from the chapter, the sentence from the paragraph, the word from the sentence. So that idea that the idea of it's sort of like the opposite of kind of classical architecture in some ways. It's turning into these individualism, these tiny units, and pulling against your place in the larger structure, which in some ways fits with those anxieties about civilization, and all the sort of panic about especially women moving outside of their allotted place in the family and in the social structure.
That is an amazing, amazing description, I think. Thank you so much for that. That is absolutely fascinating. I think it, like what you're touching on, I think has to do with almost a fear of progress, would you say? Of going too far in one direction, of civilization going too far from where they used to be. And I think that is such an interesting notion that could even be possible, that we are just traveling along one straight line and eventually the line will just get too long, you know? Like, I think that is such a, almost like a spatially very odd thing to think. It has a lot of grounds, I think, in like spatiality and like direction, kind of like what you were saying about form as well, and the fracturing of a cohesive entity. And I think a lot of modernist literature arguably is very fragmented and very fractured, probably shaped by the two wars in the 20th century as well. But would you say that that is kind of tied to modernism and what happened to form in postmodernist literature, Thomas Pynchon and things like that, who are very much pushing against form and kind of deconstructing words and texts?
Ooh, so I think I've got lots of answers to that. My brain's pinging off in lots of ways. And it's fun of doing this, that I don't have to write it down. I don't have to footnote it. I can play with ideas as we do it. I mean, in some ways, when you were saying how odd it is, the idea of civilization as this line and so on, I think in some ways, to me now, it's not that odd. And slightly so, have you heard of Kate Raworth and donut economics?
I have not.
It's the idea, it's a donut as in the old fashioned, like hole in the middle donut. And the idea is that what you want is, instead of infinite growth, and we have this idea of growth, all economics is based around growth. But if you have infinite growth, that in the human body, that's cancer.
Right.
You don't want, you want your baby to grow, but you don't want people
but eventually it stops growing, it comes out and it's severed, kind of thing.
But also once it's out, it keeps growing, but you don't want it to keep growing at the same rate throughout its life. That's bad news. There's a point where you want to stabilize, where you get to think. And in the same way, the idea of what's growth, so that we're supplying all the basics for everybody, all the essentials, but not so far that we're overstretching, that we're damaging, that it's unsustainable. And I think some of the same thoughts, and actually if you come to individualism, I think a lot of people who say, in sort of a lot of the modernists are interested in individualism, individual vision, individual feeling, individual style, the idea of individually rewriting tradition in all sorts of ways. But they're also classically trained in pretty much every case. And they come to points where sometimes they'll move backwards as well as forwards in formal terms. And there's also that question, whether it's the kind of Joseph Conrad, we live as we dream alone, which is both, which in some, there's something despairing about that as well as something liberating, So I think there's always that pull between it. And actually that element of postmodernism that's so interesting, a word is just a word, it's just a sign system, it's just a structure, and the points where that can turn into an endless hall of mirrors rather than, the desire to actually say this is about humanity in another way.
Definitely.
There are things that you're trying to say within it, so you can question the validity of the structures. You can look at how far there's no such thing as a neutral genre or a neutral structure or a neutral form. They all have their own political, aesthetic, social implications in lots of ways. So you can do a lot of showing how that works, but ultimately to make a literary work readable, if it's endlessly words about words about words about words, it's just noises. So you get it kind of goes through cycles, or that desire to come back to some kind of meaning. Or it becomes about the agony of the writer or the reader wrestling with the words endlessly, which kind of comes back to me, the agonized reader, or you, the agonized reader.
Right. And I guess it almost like detracts from the content as well. If it's just gesturing towards the writer and the reader, it's not exactly about the words anymore, potentially.
Yeah, or it becomes airless or whatever. So there's that way in which I think, and in any case, and I think there's also, I mean, it's very interesting between the kind of theorists of postmodernism, between those who see it as, in a sense, not infinite relativism, but trying to show up the ways in which words are coloured by ideas, coloured by points of view. There's no such thing as a neutral point of view. It's not the same. So there's a kind of, I think I buy much more into the Linda Hutcheon version of postmodernism that's interested in it as a political tool rather than a kind of stylistic, empty apoliticism.
Definitely. Yeah. I think so. I have studied a lot of psychoanalysis in my undergraduate and also kind of graduate degree as well. And that kind of theory definitely has that phenomenon of what you're talking about, of these endless signifiers just all gesturing to each other, and desire is wrapped up in it, and the subject, capital S, is wrapped up in it, and the symbolic is wrapped up, everything is wrapped up in everything. And it is kind of this endless hall of mirrors. So with using that psychoanalytic lens comes a lot of problems and a lot of endless significations. So I definitely understand the 19th century anxiety surrounding too much excess and too much decadence and progress, and in that sense, death potentially, because too much will eventually explode and the death drive will kick in. So yeah, no, I think that is a very kind of strange complex over there happening. Yeah, definitely.
Well, I think more, and I think it's happened in scholarship over about the last 20 years, especially, is the recognition of decadence as very much a kind of midwife to modernism, freeing up of things, another way of pushing back against tradition and convention and public opinion and all sorts of the kind of forces that were holding literature in the past in different ways and constricting what the writer could say. Whereas I think if you go back 30, 40 years, decadence was mostly seen as a kind of, I don't know, a sort of rich, indulgent naughtiness, a kind of, for grown-up schoolboys, a kind of, deliberate perversity.
Right.
Rather than the kind of stylistic innovation and adventurousness and experimentation that in many ways is on a continuum with a lot of the modernist experiments.
Yeah, definitely. I've definitely heard that previous definition a lot. That's why it was kind of hard for me to wrap my head around what exactly decadence is and means and represents. But to go into a little bit about decadence and women in theater, you wrote a brilliant chapter for the Oxford Book of Decadence, which you mentioned. It has many essays in this book. And your chapter was called Decadent Theater, New Women and the Eye of the Beholder, for which you wrote, quote, "Decadence, an unhealthy deviation from an undefined norm, is necessarily in the eye of the beholder, and this was never more apparent than in theatrical representations of the modern woman," unquote. So what do you mean by this, and why is it important to look at who or kind of what institution or what person is doing the defining or beholding of decadence, and also who is performing this decadence? How does this impact these theatrical representations of the modern women, and why is that important? Why is it impactful to these representations?
Well, firstly, I'd probably say that who is doing the defining. I think people almost never define the norm. The norm is supposedly so normal that it's unspoken. It's what's like that idea of common sense. Common sense it's my sense. It's not necessarily common sense. So
the kind of universal I, kind of, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yes.
That idea that there are universal norms for what women ought to be. And a lot of the feminist writings of the later 19th century, sort of during the 19th century, in many ways, defamiliarizing, challenging those ideas of that norm. So instead of the idea that it's the woman who wants to read or study or get work or had express her own spontaneous sexuality or whatever as the abnormal, actually the idea that there's something abnormal. Ways that, say, the later 19th century, you get writers who are talking about sort of conventional ideas of womanhood as very much like, they use analogies of things like domesticated animals or birds that are used to being caged, or Chinese foot binding is one of the often kind of racist ideas, the idea that the kind of cultural norms that are not in any way natural, they are structured, and that people have grown, to the domesticated woman, in a sense. The domestic woman is a social product. There's nothing natural or normal about
Exactly.
that, and an idea of what's possible with other opportunities and so on. So there are lots of debates about, whether it's clothing, corsets, skirts, shoes, all the sort of thing about what the body might be naturally as against what's become fashionable or aesthetically pleasing, is almost a kind of analogy for, a symbol of the potential of what women could be physically and intellectually and spiritually if allowed more freedom.
Right, definitely. Yeah. And I want to touch on this idea that women were subverting these universal norms in their performances on the 19th century stage. And so you write that their performances can thus be understood as active interventions in debates about literary, cultural, and social notions of decadence and the role of women within them, more importantly. So I think this is incredibly well put. Can you tell us a little bit about how these female actors were subverting and challenging notions of the universal woman, what a woman should be, decadence, female sexuality, and their own psychosexual gendered roles as actors and women in theater?
Well, I think part of it is the actress herself as a professional working woman, as a woman who's on the public stage, where it involves a high level of professional artistry, public profile, earning, often independent. There's a sense in which there are some women, some professional actresses who were struggling for kind of middle class respectability and kind of domestic image. People like Madge Kendall, for example, Fanny Kemble, worried about that, and so on. So there were certainly people who were leading that, but for a lot of the actresses, actually, there's more of a sense of they took the power that came with that. So there's a kind of continuum really between late 1880s, 1890s. Some of those really high profile actresses then become leading lights in the suffrage campaign. So the Actresses Franchise League, which is founded in 1907, becomes a really important power in the campaign for women's suffrage. And it's not accidental that female playwrights and female theatre professionals are really important in that, using their public celebrity and their professionalism and their glamour to kind of speak for women in the workplace. So they're in what, in one sense, is a very glamorous workplace, and in another sense is a lot of incredibly long hours and precarity, and very hard to sustain stable domesticity alongside it. So the domesticity they have is in a very different form, often with children touring with them, with larger kind of structures of grandparents and friends and relatives and so on, doing childcare for them and so on. So there's all sorts of ways in which, and sometimes you get leading actresses where the men are the kind of tag-alongs, are the support team, are the very much the subordinate role in that relationship, and in that business partnership as well. So that's one of the ways in which they're kind of publicly breaking norms and then using that, harnessing that to political effect. I think on stage, probably the sort of classic example which you turn to would be Elizabeth Robins playing Hedda Gabler. So Ibsen's Hedda Gabler being a woman who is frustrated by, she resents being pregnant. She sees it as a kind of taking over of her body. She's trapped in domesticity, because she hasn't got money or a career of her own or a way of expressing her greater ambition and her in some ways longing for something more remarkable in life, more she's got vision in some ways but no way of realizing it, and she's clever and resourceful, and she mostly uses that up on bullying an old school friend, on manipulating, on insulting her her husband's aunt and so on. She's got no outlet for it really, apart from sort of spite and manipulation and so on, and it comes from this frustration. And that role was, that play was put on, produced by two women, Marianne Lee and Elizabeth Robbins. And especially the way that Robbins and a huge number of women who acted the play, it became a standard part of a celebrity actress repertoire. So all the major actresses played Hedda Gabler as a way of, I think, seeing her not as abnormal. So you've got a lot of critics, especially who read the play and didn't see it performed, describing Hedda in a series of negatives. She's not human, she's not feminine, she's not beautiful, she's and lots and lots of animalistic kind of imagery. She's something, all she is an absence of what a woman ought to be, as against the critics who saw the role of Hedda performed, for example, by Elizabeth Robbins, who are simultaneously repulsed and enthralled. And the number of women who respond by, well, the number of male critics who were suddenly sort of feeling like they're surrounded potentially by Heddas in the audience, this kind of sense that they, the critics who are literally saying you never know when you're sitting next to her at a dinner party or something like that. And all these women who are responding to the role as Hedda is, Hedda is all of us in some ways. So it becomes this extraordinary, that idea of something else under the surface, all this potential that's unrealized and frustrated and sometimes bursting out in other ways. That would be the classic, what I mean, so it's the ultimate, at the time, received as kind of the ultimate decadent play, not in a kind of stylistic decadence, but rather in an expression of this kind of super refinement of this, the idea that Hedda is this product of later 19th century society, is product of sophistication, but also something kind of animalistic underneath there.
Yeah, that is really, really fascinating. Kind of how important theater is in the normal day-to-day realm. People probably who have never seen theater, how important those pieces actually, they were having such domino effects over all 19th century culture. And yeah, I think this fear of womanhood and the fear of the new woman and what a woman could be, I think is a really interesting fear, honestly, to have in this 19th century culture. But I think a lot of what you were saying, it was really reminding me of our day and age and actresses now, like what you were saying about long hours and professionalism and things like this. But there was this kind of dark underbelly. Maybe they couldn't have kids and be, a very present mother. They're missing their kids because they're working all day or whatever it may be. It reminds me of things like the Me Too movement, where actually there's a lot of darkness happening, but no one knows about it. Or things like how you were saying they get involved in politics, and that's very, very important actually because of who they are. It really reminds me of people asking celebrity figures like Taylor Swift to speak on things like, why isn't she commenting on the American presidential election or things or whatever it may be, or climate change, or, and she actually has immense cultural power as this kind of singer actress kind of persona, making films and also making music. And I think characterizing women like that in those professional roles is it's this kind of dichotomy, I think, of at once it's super liberating and it puts them, you're right, in this very high earning professional role. But then also, I think we're going to get into a little bit about why it could also put them in misogynistic or sexist situations, like with the obsession on female sexuality in a lot of these plays. And I think, again, even now that continues with certain actresses always being characterized as a sex symbol. I'm thinking even like Brigitte Bardot and Marilyn Monroe and things like this. So they're super successful, famous actresses, but kind of at what cost? And it's so interesting. It's like, I can't really tell which one outweighs the other, if you know what I mean.
I think some of it is that I mean, I think, so there are lots of different, there's so many things tied in there. And I think some of it, if we go back to, so you're saying it reminds you of the present day in all sorts of ways, I think absolutely. In the way that, say, Hedda Gabler as a role became an articulation for all sorts of questions about what woman could be at that moment, or a certain type of woman. If you think of, I don't know, Fleabag, Phoebe Waller-Bridge
Yes.
in Fleabag, or before that, the way that, say, Bridget Jones was a kind of
Yes.
focus for a certain kind of woman, a certain kind of experience, which was maybe not in focus and then came into focus in a different way.
Right.
And then all sorts of questions about whether that's empowering or disempowering, whether it's a cliche, whether it's way of seeing things. So I think there's a way in which those kind of roles, especially when charismatically imagined or performed, become huge kind of cultural articulations. They bring things into focus, but they also prompt other conversations in that way. So,
Definitely.
you know, that, and if we think of Phoebe Waller-Bridge and Fleabag, the sense of the fact that she's a writer as well, that it starts as a one-woman show, the ways
Yeah.
that she's got a kind of profile as a performer, as a writer, potentially as a producer, you know, the sense of
Yeah.
agency that connects to her, that's very close to the kind of agency that people like Mrs. Patrick Campbell, Sarah Bernhardt, Eleanor Duse, Elizabeth Robbins as actress and producer and playwright, you know, and suffragist, that absolutely they have that. And I think now Hollywood actresses, there's an interest. Have you seen the film Suffragette?
I've seen a part of it, but I haven't on an airplane, but I haven't been able to finish
Yeah.
it. But I know very much like
Yeah.
the plot of it. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's a wonderful so their discussion about whether, so to get the film off the ground and everything else, they managed to get Meryl Streep to play Mrs. Pankhurst, and that was, you know, sort of, so to get the kind of clout that Meryl Streep has as an artist, as an icon, and so on, and
Right.
put her in the role of Emmeline Pankhurst, that was a kind of coup that again
Right.
articulates that sort of nexus of celebrity and identity and power, and where you're both seeing the role and the actress playing the role are somehow kind of bouncing off each other.
Yeah.
So both are visible. And that was true of, say, Ellen Terry, who in the 1880s was the highest earning woman in the UK, second only to Queen Victoria.
Wow.
I know. And so she's most famous as a Shakespeare actress, but she plays a huge number of other, mostly often quite sentimental roles. But she becomes this kind of figurehead for kind of Victorian womanhood in lots of ways, you know, most famous for playing Ophelia and Cordelia and so on. She never gets to play Rosalind in As You Like It, you know, so she's
Yeah.
largely in those kind of, a lot of the roles she was most famous for were quite sentimental roles. Sometimes she was very frustrated by that. But in the pageant of great women, a sort of huge suffrage pageant, she was the only actress in that to have speaking lines as herself. And she ends by talking about but for actresses. So there's a whole kind of parade of actresses through the centuries. And she comes on dressed in one of her most famous roles. And says how, you know, if it weren't for women playing actresses, you would have no, I'm trying to remember the names of it, no Woffington, no, I can't remember what, and no Ellen Terry. So she kind of name checks herself in role and as herself in costume in that. And that was that was performed in the Albert Hall, you know, in this enormous venue as one of the really big suffrage fundraisers. So there's an interesting way in which you can't, that's what I mean by the performances themselves are political activism in a way. They're kind of making
Definitely.
sorts of social statements in that way.
Definitely. It makes me think about a lot of ideas of like subjectivity and identity, and the woman as playing her role in the play or movie or whatever it may be, while simultaneously playing her role as a celebrity, as a public figure, while simultaneously playing or pushing against her role as universal woman or gender norm woman. So there are kind of three roles happening here: playing or not playing the ideal woman, the fallen woman, the new woman, the failed woman, whatever it may be, the successful woman, the mothering woman, her role in society, playing her role as a public figure, and playing her role in the media that she's playing in. I think that those three things, they're very kind of wound up in each other. And I think celebrity studies covers that a lot.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And there's a sense in which it's the interaction between those roles, but also the way that nuancing one nuances another and has an impact on it. So yeah, it's a kind of fascinating. So I'm really, in some ways with theatre, I spend a lot of time with reception, a lot of time looking at newspaper reviews and so on, because it's that, part of that is that ability to try and reimagine. So you can only really reimagine from those descriptions and the impact it's having on people, but also you're analyzing the language in which things are being received, the kind of assumptions that lie behind it. So you're both trying to recreate the thing itself, but also recreate the way in which it's being received, and then trying to sort of clean that off so you get further back to the thing itself, or you're looking at the interaction between those. So in one sense, kind of dealing with smoke, because if you're studying the novel, you can go back to the original, you can go back to what did the first edition look like. You can find out how much it cost. You can actually hold the thing and read the same pages that somebody first read, including exactly the typeface it had and so on. Whereas you cannot get back to the original performance. And even then, you must have had the experience of, go to one performance of a play and somebody else sees it the next night, and the audience makeup is different. Go to a matinee and an evening performance and they feel quite different. That so in that sense, that's what I mean by you're trying, there's something so amorphous about what you're trying to recapture and deal with, especially if you're dealing with it, trying to recreate it from, the bits of evidence left, and then the critical reception of it with all the assumptions and accretions around that. That's kind of what I love.
Yeah, so I have produced a lot of shows at the ADC Theater in Cambridge, and I remember sitting in the audience trying, we had to watch the show every night. I was, sometimes assistant directing, sometimes producing, but I remember the director being so frustrated at the audience makeup sometimes, saying things like, "Oh, they were loving it yesterday. They were laughing. They were so into it. Now no one's laughing. They're all quiet. What's happening?" I'm like, it's a Monday night. Maybe they're tired. Maybe they have an essay due tomorrow. I don't know, And I think that whole idea of, I loved what you were saying about almost trying to get back to the thing itself, because you have the cultural perception, the performance, the public figure, the role of woman in this inauthentic way she's playing to satisfy normal kind of cultural norms, not her role as public figure, but normal woman, let's say, in that common sense term. But trying to get back to who is this person at their core, and how is she signifying and why, I think is really interesting. And actually really reminds me of what we were talking about earlier about form and decadence, and how these words keep bouncing off each other and signifying each other until maybe eventually it falls apart and there's nothing underneath. It really reminds me of that, actually.
And I think with theatre, what I'm also fascinated by is how far it's not about the thing itself, the thing on the inside. It's about how we project to the inside of character from things on the outside. So there's a sense in which it's not just the actor, say, the actress creating Hedda Gabler. We, each individual audience member receiving that performance, is then creating her psychology. So we're projecting inside. So there's a really interesting way where it's pointless talking about what is the core of, or what is the essence of something. You're looking at what codes, what gestures, how they're understanding, how they're projecting and creating, and how that kind of makes. That's one of the things I love about theatre, is that it's not literal, it's collaborative. It's what the theatre can do to spark off that imagination and encourage us as audience member to create what we're seeing.
Definitely. I want to just quickly, before we close, because I don't want to take up all of your day, and thank you so much. I want to say before we close, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a lovely discussion so far. I really, really appreciate it. And it's been absolutely fascinating. I've learned a lot. I hope everyone watching has learned a lot too. I want to just quickly touch on your second book, Acts of Desire, Women and Sex on Stage, 1800 to 1930, which I think is a fascinating study on, as you say, theatrical representation of illicit female sexuality. So I'm wondering, what place did such representations have in the 19th and early 20th centuries? And what were the socio-political and moral stigmas around female sexuality in this time? I want to learn a little bit about why there was this obsession on female sexuality. You say, quote, "For decades, playwrights have been driven to employ all of their ingenuity and stagecraft in order to smuggle the spectacle of the sexually transgressive and actively desiring woman onto the stage. But by the 1890s, the woman with a past, as you call it, had become a theatrical obsession. Her sexual history openly acknowledged and her place in society endlessly discussed." So why was there this obsession on the fallen woman, on illicit female sexuality? What was happening to create these things?
Well, I think there are very different answers to that on where you are in the 19th century. So I kind of started with that after working on Oscar Wilde, and a realization, I mean, how many of his plays are on the issue of female sexuality and how far he's writing. So through the 1880s and 1890s, if you look at the most kind of the most celebrated plays, the most famous plays of that era, ridiculous number of them are debating, you know, what is the morality of women having sex outside of marriage? If a woman's had sex before marriage or outside of marriage or something like that, is she inherently tainted goods? Must she be expelled from society? Can she make a good wife? You know, is she redeemable? And so on, was endlessly debated. So I think the easy answer to why that was at that point was, in many ways, this is the point where, you know, the kind of women are challenging conventional roles more than at any other time in many ways. You know, it's the push for women's higher education. It's, you know, post the married women's property rights. It's, you know, campaigning for changes in the marriage laws. It's women's access to the professions. You know, there's so much, you know, for in some cases access to reproductive rights and so on. So there's a huge amount happening at this time, and in some ways reducing it to women's sexuality is a way of controlling it. So, which goes again to what you were saying about, you know, how far it kind of comes back to sex when you look at celebrity actresses and so on. Now there's a kind of reduce it all to sex, and so on, and that idea of what a woman must want and must be. So
And it's still happening.
Exactly. Apparently, all Jennifer Aniston wants is a baby. You know, as though
Exactly.
that. Well, what else would any woman want? You know, she might have everything else, but she hasn't got a baby. She'd be sad.
Exactly.
You know, there's this kind of, so those narratives keep going, and in some ways, that was a lot of these plays around women's sexuality are a way of reducing that. Reducing women's agency, bringing it down to certain things. So there's a lot of anti-feminist theatre in that form. And then rewrites of those central plots become a way of twisting the story around. So that's always something that, for writers who recognize, which we all do, the ways in which certain plots have assumptions, you know, like how many feminists, you know, in the 1980s, there was a real thing of rewriting fairy tales. You know, how many versions are there now of kind of films in which it's rewriting Cinderella or Snow White or whatever else, where you try and, you know, you give the heroine, the Disney princess, some kind of agency and intelligence and rewrite the, you know, rewrite the power relations in that story is a way of, you notice the difference from what you're expecting. So that's one of the ways that some of the more radical play, whether it's say Shaw's Mrs. Warren's Profession in 1893, he's writing a version of the Fallen Woman play where it's about economics and it's about female agency, where in a society that doesn't pay women well for anything but pleasing men, you know, actually becoming a prostitute and really making money is a lot better than working in a bar and your good looks selling the drinks while you get paid starvation wages. So actually it's not about morality, it's about economics. So that's kind of Shaw rewriting that genre in all sorts of ways. If you go back to, I started looking at that and then was trying to say, where did this come from? And I ended up retracing. I started at 1800 simply because that was, I couldn't go back, you know, I was tempted to go back further. No, stop, I have to start somewhere. So there.
Yeah.
And if you look at around 1800, the sort of very early in the century, a lot of the idea of the woman who, the daughter who gets tempted away from the father's authority, in lots of ways, those kind of seduction melodramas and so on are a way of reasserting patriarchal power, reasserting the protective male, reasserting ideas of sexual and social responsibility. So, in lots of ways, they're quite conservative forms, but they often come with the main narrative in those. And you've got, when I say the sort of smuggling in female sexuality, that's because you have stage censorship. So stage censorship in Britain was ended in 1968. So up till then, plays are basically, they have to pass through the censor's office, and that's by script alone. So a lot of the sexuality is therefore a lot of the more subversive things are happening in the sidelines, they're happening in the action, not in the script, but in the, in between the lines, the ways that they're rendered and things like that. So you get a lot of working class women, or, the kind of comic servant or whatever, who's got a lot more sexual agency and a lot more cynical nous than the heroine who will lose her virginity and then go mad and then end up on the streets and all this kind of, the ones who have good strong arms and quite capable of fighting their corner and a sense of practically what pays, seem to be coexisting but in the margins, or alongside that another kind of narrative running through. So that's the sort of, in that sense, I could give you all sorts of different ways in which, I mean, at the beginning of the 20th century, you get a lot of plays about working women. And they're the ways in which, again, sexuality and sexual judgment is about power, and women who are economically independent are then sexually independent. If you don't need a man to, kind of keep you safe and sheltered and all the rest of it, you can choose if you're paying your own rent. So there's a lot more of that kind of exploration of the other possibilities that come with that happen at the beginning of the 20th.
Definitely.